The storm had been building for 3 days, and Talon could feel it in her hollow bones. From her perch high in the ancient Douglas fir, she watched the dark clouds roll across the Alaskan wilderness like a living thing, swallowing mountains whole. At 15 years old, she was no stranger to harsh weather, but something about this storm felt different, angrier, more violent than the seasonal tempests she'd weathered before. The first gust nearly knocked her from the branch. Talon spread her 7-foot wingspan, using every feather to maintain balance as the wind howled through the forest. Below, smaller birds had already taken shelter, but eagles didn't have that luxury. Her territory stretched for miles, and somewhere in this wilderness, her mate Kodiak was hunting, unaware of what was coming. She launched herself into the growing maelstrom, her keen eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of him. The wind caught her like a rag doll, sending her tumbling through the air before she managed to right herself. Flying in these conditions was like trying to swim upstream in a raging river, but Talon had survived worse. She'd lived through forest fires, harsh winters when prey was scarce, and the gradual encroachment of human development that had pushed her kind to the edges of their ancestral lands. A flash of white caught her attention. Kodiak's distinctive head plumage visible against the dark spruce trees near the river. He was struggling too, fighting to reach their nest where their 2 eaglets waited. Talon called out, her piercing cry barely audible above the wind, but Kodiak heard her. Together, they battled their way home. The nest, built over years and reinforced each season, sat in the crown of a massive cottonwood that had stood for over a century. It was a fortress of sticks, moss, and determination, but even it seemed fragile against the approaching fury. Their eaglets, Storm and River, huddled together in the center, their dark juvenile feathers ruffled with fear. As the first real winds hit, Talon positioned herself over her young, spreading her wings like a living umbrella. Kodiak took the windward side, his powerful frame absorbing the worst of the gusts. The tree swayed violently, and Talon could feel the nest shifting beneath them. Sticks that had been carefully woven into place began to loosen and fly away. The rain came next, not the gentle precipitation of spring, but driving sheets of water that stung like needles. Talon's waterproof outer feathers shed most of it, but the cold seeped through to her skin. She could feel Storm and River shivering beneath her, and she pressed closer, sharing what warmth she could. Hours passed. The storm raged with increasing intensity, and Talon began to wonder if their ancient tree would hold. She'd heard the crack of falling timber throughout the forest, the groaning protests of wood pushed beyond its limits. Each gust threatened to be the one that would send them all tumbling into the chaos below. Then disaster struck. A massive branch from a neighboring tree, torn free by the wind, came crashing down onto their nest. The impact sent a shockwave through the cottonwood, and suddenly half their home was gone, scattered to the wind. River, the smaller of the 2 eaglets, was swept toward the edge of what remained. Without hesitation, Talon lunged forward, catching her chick in her powerful talons just as it slipped over the side. But the movement left her off balance, and another gust caught her wings, threatening to pull her from the tree entirely. For a terrifying moment, she hung suspended between safety and the abyss. River clutched against her chest, the wind trying to claim them both. Kodiak's beak clamped down on her tail feathers, anchoring her to the nest. Together, they pulled back from the brink, but their situation had become desperate. The nest was no longer safe, and the storm showed no signs of abating. Talon made a decision that went against every instinct. Eagles didn't abandon their nests, they defended them to the death. But sometimes survival meant breaking the rules. She gathered River in her talons while Kodiak took Storm, and together they launched into the maelstrom, seeking shelter elsewhere. Flying with a passenger in these conditions was nearly impossible. River's weight threw off Talon's balance, and the eaglet's panic made it struggle, further complicating her flight. She could barely see through the driving rain, navigating by instinct and memory toward a series of caves she'd noticed during hunting flights. The wind slammed them sideways into a cliff face, and Talon felt something give in her left wing. Pain shot through her shoulder, but she couldn't stop. Behind her, she could hear Kodiak struggling with the same challenges, storms, cries barely audible above the storm. The cave entrance was smaller than she'd remembered, barely wide enough for her wingspan. Talon had to fold her wings tight and dive through the opening, trusting that the space beyond would be large enough. They tumbled onto the rocky floor in a tangle of feathers and relief. Kodiak arrived moments later, Storm still clutched safely in his talons. The cave was dry and spacious, carved from the cliff by centuries of wind and water. It wasn't home, but it was sanctuary. For the next 18 hours, they waited. The storm raged outside with unprecedented fury, but inside the cave, they were safe. Talon's wing throbbed with each heartbeat, and she knew it would take time to heal properly. But they were alive, all of them, and that was what mattered. When the winds finally died and the rain became a gentle patter, Talon ventured to the cave entrance. The forest below was transformed, trees down everywhere, the landscape scarred and changed. Their cottonwood still stood, but the nest was completely gone, scattered across miles of wilderness. Starting over would be difficult, especially with her injured wing. But as she watched Storm and River explore their temporary home, chattering excitedly about their adventure, Talon felt something she hadn't expected. A hope. They'd survived the unsurvivable, adapted when adaptation seemed impossible. Over the following weeks, as her wing healed, Talon and Kodiak began the process of rebuilding. They found a new tree, even more massive than the last, and began the patient work of construction. Storm and River, now old enough to help, brought sticks and moss, learning the ancient art of nest building. The new nest was different from the old one, stronger in some ways, incorporating lessons learned from the storm. Talon built in better drainage, more flexible joints that could bend without breaking. She positioned it to take advantage of natural windbreaks while maintaining the commanding view eagles required. As autumn approached and the eaglets prepared for their first migration, Talon reflected on the storm that had nearly destroyed them. It had taken their home, tested their bonds, and pushed them to their absolute limits, but it had also revealed their true strength, not just their ability to endure, but their capacity to adapt, to make hard choices, and to rebuild something better from the ruins of the old. The day Storm and River took their first real flights, soaring on thermals that carried them high above the forest, Talon felt a deep satisfaction. They were survivors now, tested by nature's fury and proven worthy. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and there would be many in the changing world, they would face them with the knowledge that they could overcome anything. Talon watched her territory change in ways both subtle and profound. Storm and River had long since established their own domains, but they still returned each spring, bringing news from distant lands and sometimes new mates to introduce. 3 years after the Great Storm, Talon noticed the first signs of something different stirring in the forest. Humans had begun appearing more frequently, not the occasional hiker or researcher she was accustomed to, but groups carrying strange equipment and marking trees with bright orange paint. Kodiak spotted them first during a morning hunt, his sharp eyes catching the glint of metal instruments in the valley below. When he returned to share his findings, Talon felt an old familiar tension in her chest, the same instinct that had warned her about the storm years before. The humans worked methodically, sectioning off portions of the forest, taking measurements, and leaving behind small flags that fluttered in the wind like territorial markers. Talon had seen this before, in the southern reaches of her original territory, where ancient groves had given way to roads and buildings. But this time felt different. These humans moved with a different purpose, their equipment more sophisticated, their presence more respectful of the wilderness around them. They worked quietly, disturbed nothing unnecessarily, and seemed to study the forest rather than simply claim it. One morning, as Talon soared over their worksite, she noticed something that made her circle back for a closer look. The humans had erected a tall structure, not the harsh metal towers she'd learned to associate with danger, but something that seemed almost organic, designed to blend with the forest canopy. From her perch in a nearby pine, she watched as they installed what appeared to be cameras and sensors, devices that hummed quietly but didn't disturb the natural rhythms of the woodland. A woman with graying hair and gentle movements seemed to be directing the operation, occasionally pointing toward Talon's own territory with what looked like reverence rather than conquest. Days passed, and the humans' presence became routine. They observed without interfering, documented without destroying. Talon began to understand that these weren't the developers she'd feared, but something else entirely, protectors, perhaps, or students of the wild places. Her suspicions were confirmed when Storm returned from his southern territory with urgent news. A massive development project was planned for the entire river valley, one that would transform thousands of acres of wilderness into a sprawling complex of buildings and roads. The humans in her forest weren't there to prepare for destruction. They were there to prevent it. The woman with gray hair, Talon learned by watching, was documenting everything. The nesting sites, the migration patterns, the delicate web of relationships that made this ecosystem unique. She worked with the patience of someone who understood that true knowledge took time, that the forest revealed its secrets only to those willing to listen. As autumn approached, Talon made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of maintaining her usual distance from human activity, she began to make herself visible during the woman's observations. Not close enough to be threatening, but near enough to be noticed, to be counted, to be part of whatever record was being created. The woman noticed, of course. Talon could see the excitement in her movements when she spotted the great eagle, the careful way she documented each sighting without trying to get closer. There was respect in that distance, an understanding that some boundaries should never be crossed. Winter brought news that the development project had been halted. The documentation gathered by the research team had revealed the valley's ecological significance, its role as a crucial corridor for migrating species and a sanctuary for creatures like Talon's family. The forest would remain wild, protected by laws that recognized its irreplaceable value. When spring returned, Talon found herself sharing her territory with a new kind of neighbor. The research station remained, but it had evolved into something more, a place where humans came to learn rather than to take, to observe the ancient rhythms that had sustained this land for millennia. Storm and River brought their own offspring now, teaching them the same lessons Talon had learned from her parents and passed on to them. How to read the wind, how to find the thermals that could carry them across vast distances, how to survive in a world that was always changing. But they also learned new lessons, ones that Talon's generation had never needed to know. They learned to distinguish between the humans who meant harm and those who meant to help, to navigate a world where wilderness and civilization existed in an increasingly complex dance. On quiet mornings, when the mist rose from the river and the forest was still waking up, Talon would sometimes see the gray-haired woman sitting motionless at the edge of the research station, simply watching the world come alive. In those moments, Talon understood that they were both guardians of the same precious thing, this wild place that had shaped them both, in different ways, into who they were meant to be. The great storm had taught Talon that survival sometimes meant abandoning everything familiar and starting over. But the years that followed taught her something equally important. That adaptation didn't always mean loss. Sometimes it meant finding new ways to protect what mattered most, new alliances in the endless work of keeping the wild places wild. As she soared high above her domain on the thermals of a perfect spring morning, Talon could see the future spreading out below her like a vast landscape of possibility. There would be challenges ahead, there always were, but there would also be allies, both feathered and human, working together to ensure that the ancient songs of the wilderness would continue to echo through these mountains for generations yet to come. The story of survival, she realized, was never really about just one creature, one storm, one moment of crisis. It was about the countless small acts of courage and adaptation that, woven together over time, created something larger and more enduring than any individual life. It was about the understanding that in protecting the wild, we protect something essential in ourselves, something that, once lost, can never truly be recovered. And so Talon flew on, her keen eyes watching over a world that was always changing but somehow, in its deepest essence, always the same.